EU4 is a game full of complex systems, or as one could call them, features. Some features, like the combat system, may be complex, but they don't hide from you. You interact with the EU4 combat system every time you take a fight against other countries, against rebels, or even against natives. Other systems, like trade winds or technology groups, may be a bit more hidden, but upon investigation and prodding, you usually find them anyway. But in a game as complex and as old as EU4, there are features and game mechanics that are insanely obscure and usually useless. There is security and obscurity after all, and having an average game impact of 0 throughout thousands of campaigns is an excellent way of staying hidden in plain sight. But today I want to bring to light, as it were, 5 features in E4 that get progressively more and more obscure, and generally progressively more and more useless. Although I will say right now, Feature 3 that's upcoming is, in my opinion, insanely underrated, and I believe has the highest potential for the cool factor out here, but I understand why it's so obscure. With that said, do feel free to tell me which one out of these 5 you already knew about in the comments down below. And with that, one final request for a like if you haven't already, and if you're around for a subscription, well, that would be amazing. But anyway, enough self-shitting, let's get started with our first feature of the day, namely, victory cards. So how do you find these victory cards? Well, if you head on over to the diplomatic map mode and go right to the bottom, you will see the option to select victory cards, if any. At which point, if you're doing this in single player, you will realize that there are no victory cards selected, because this is a feature exclusive to multiplayer, a domain that 98% of people who play EU4 don't play. On top of the 2%, however, that do play multiplayer, unless you played multiplayer around 3 to 4 years ago, and even then, it's a 50-50 if that occurred to you, you probably didn't interact with victory cards because most multiplayer campaigns turn them off. So what do victory cards do? Well, EU4 has a score system. This is a bit less obscure because the actual score system can be relatively useful for gauging the strength of enemy nations. What I mean by that is, for example, the administrative rank, that as you can see there I'm getting 0.18, comes from my administrative score. And if I were to, for example, as England, go ahead and take a loan, this is going to reduce my administrative rank by 0.02. However, if we were to check in the ledger, let's consult the ledger right now and go to country and go to score comparison, well, we can look at our admin rating. As you can see, it's reduced by 0.02 due to loans. This is the same for every single country in the game. It's reduced by 0.02 for every loan you have. And that means that score can be useful in the ledger to tell in live time the amount of debt that a nation has, which is very helpful in features, well, like multiplayer, where you want to know the state of debt in your enemy country. So the score isn't that obscure, that's fine. However, victory cards kind of are, because victory cards serve only one purpose, and that is if you conquer and control them, they give you extra score. But if they are so useless, why do people not just leave them on in multiplayer where they're now turned off by default? Well, if you do, say, play a campaign as England and you decide to make an alliance with France and want to keep that alliance for the rest of the game, usually people tend to just do that. Or, for example, if you're playing as Castile and form Spain and want to keep out with Portugal. The way victory cards work is you're very likely, if you're playing as England, to get a victory card on France, and vice versa, if you're playing as Castile, you're very likely to get a victory card on Portugal. Now, if you're ignoring score, you can ignore score and don't go for the victory card and don't get the score points. However, if there is a victory card that you don't possess at all or are not claiming and are basically allied with the overall person, this upsets your estates by 10% per victory card. And this means that if you are playing quite late into the campaign and you've ignored victory cards really hard and ignored like 3 of them, you're going to be running minus 30% loyalty on all of your estates, which is quite damaging. And for that reason, most multiplayer games which would score things without using the score system would just not use the score system and hence not use victory cards and turn them off, because all they did is that if you ignored them, sometimes they would decrease your estate loyalty, kind of forcing you to half interact with them even when you really didn't want to. I think it's kind of a sad state. I think if score was tweaked a little bit more to be more interesting, and perhaps if some modability features were introduced towards the score system, I'm not sure they're already there, maybe it could be used as an actual win system in multiplayer games again, but that's a separate debate. Either way, victory cards in the state they are at the moment are a multiplayer-only feature sitting at the bottom of the diplomatic map mode build, and in general contributing pretty much nothing to anything. However, it's only downhill from here, because that is just feature number 1 on the list, and we'll now move to number 2. For feature number 2 on this list, we need to leave behind England, go back to the main menu, and actually change the very setup of EU4 itself. We need to head on over to Options, go to Custom Setup, and instead of the historical setup that we all know and love, we need to go ahead and select, for example, Custom Setup, which would proceed to uncolonize the world and let us populate it with custom nations for us to play. It's certainly a way of playing EU4, not a very popular one, and I'm wagering a lot of people don't know this exists. But if you do, well, you've seen this before, you've seen custom nation games, nothing too special here, this is a pretty open feature. But what I specifically want to highlight here is going to be how Paradox has dealt with these uncolonized provinces in areas that usually tend to have colonized provinces. So let's quickly throw together a custom nation that we can pop into, and I'll explain what I mean. So, if we were to take a look at, for example, this province here in the Gold Coast, which starts the game even in conventional setup as an uncolonized province, we can see that Paradox has coded in the amount of natives that are meant to live in the province, their aggression and their ferocity. It's also coded in a set of tables for trade good distribution, which gives you the distribution chance of finding them on this province. So for example, there's a 21.8% chance of finding slaves in the Gold Coast, and there's a 0% chance of finding gold on the Gold Coast. Thank you, Paradox, very cool. This random chance means that on average, the distribution of trade goods are still relatively normal and historical, but also introduces a pretty unique system of, for lack of a better word, trade good gambling, trying to get good trade goods, for example, dyes and silks, while also having the chance of rolling pretty bad trade goods like fish. It's certainly a neat system, but I'm sure many people wouldn't know that Paradox actually didn't just do it for the provinces that are meant to be uncolonized at game start. No, as you can detect in this kind of setup, if we were to click on literally any province, for example Ulm here because I had to, Paradox has actually coded the native, aggressiveness and ferocity counts for every single province in the game, including the provinces that start colonized, for example Ulm here. Not only does it still have the native values for its aggressiveness, ferocity and count, as I just mentioned, it also has the exact same table for distributing trade goods. In this case, for example, a 41% chance of finding fur, 25% chance of livestock, 14% chance of grain, and so on and so forth. I'm sure you're capable of reading it. And I find this rather fascinating because not only is this a system that most people will not ever interact with, if they just didn't do this and let the default trade good remain on the provinces, I don't think anyone would have cared. But they quite literally went through every single province and defined native counts inside of them. As you can see, there are different counts in all of them, each with different aggressiveness and ferocity values, which is kind of interesting. So that's a thing. They've also retained their province modifiers, but that's just to be expected, to be honest. As well as, of course, the religion map mode is the same as the province religions that they start with. This time, though, it's just not shaded like you'd normally expect to see the Greece area shaded with the Sunni light green, as it starts controlled by the Ottomans. But indeed, all of the provinces, in terms of their information, like their trade good distributions, as well as natives, aggressiveness and ferocity, are actually coded. But that's going to be it for feature number 2, and with that we're going to move on to feature number 3, which is actually going to take us outside of EU4. Indeed, here we are in the EU4 game files. Not only is this place really helpful for me to find modifiers for modifier stacking, it's also basically a list of everything that's in here is moddable, because the way that EU4 mods work is you change everything inside the game files to your mod's liking. This is how big overhauls like Amber are able to work, because they're able to change quite literally everything, and so much of the game is inside of these mod files. There are, of course, still some things that are hard-coded into EU4 itself and cannot be changed, but you'll be surprised to know just how many things are actually not hard-coded and are moddable. And that's going to be the topic of our discussion today. See, the tech groups themselves, as you can see, there's Western, which defines their starting tech level, their start cost modifier for custom nation building, and extra values if they are a, for example, Western inside of the New World continent for the capture, and so on and so forth. Features great for modding, thanks to having this paradox. However, what I'm actually here for today is this very, very small little bit of code right at the bottom here. This little tables section. This lets us define admin tech, dip tech, and mil tech to be within these 3 files. I've actually opened them here, and as you can see, the first thing that admin tech defines is that you need admin points to take admin tech, you need dip points to take dip tech, you need mil tech points to take mil tech. Now, nothing too unusual here, but this is moddable, as in the game supports you doing custom tech and then defining, where to just copy paste and change this into mil, something like this. We'll then be able to create our own custom.txt file inside the technology folder, as you can see here. And yes, this is my directory, make that what you will. And once we do that, we can actually make our entirely own technology branch. Now, a lot of mods change around techs. Some of them, like Extended Timeline, naturally have to provide content from the year 2 AD all the way to 9999. That's fine. But I haven't really seen any other mod create their entirely new tech tree option. I can kind of see why. First of all, you need to make your own UI for it. You need to define your own table, as well as defining your own UI for where the technology would actually sit. And naturally, that's quite a lot of work. And then you have to still make every single tech for that tech tree path. And on top of that, you can't mod in a custom monarch point, so it's still going to be like a second mil tech that you can use. It's a very underrated feature in my opinion. It would be cool to, for example, separate artillery, infantry, and cavalry techs into different categories, so you could like focus into one and like maybe choose to be behind in cavalry tech, or if you're a cavalry nation, choose to be behind infantry tech or something like that, right? I think that could be a very cool system. However, it's just not really used for modding at all. Weirdly enough, though, this did get updated by Paradox. So, for example, up until 2022, if you were to define a custom tech table like this, the AI would never recognize that these other technologies that were not admin, dip, and mill, well, they would never recognize they exist because they were hard-coded to have a weight of 0 for things that are not admin, dip, and mill. Paradox actually changed this in 2022 and gave them a weight, and they take technologies normally now within the other custom tech table. So it's pretty cool in that regard, and weirdly enough getting updated. But yeah, it's in the game, and pretty much no mod ever uses this. I think it's a very slept-on feature. I understand it's a lot of work to set up, but I'd love to see some kind of other technology and alternative tech trees popping up from this. For feature number 4, though, we're going to be returning to England, a nation I famously never play, because we're here to discuss a little quirk when it comes to state maintenance. Now, it's not state maintenance as a whole. It'd be very funny for me to say state maintenance is actually the issue. To see state maintenance, you need to hover over state income and see the breakdown of each province's state maintenance contribution, or in the economy tab, you can go and see state maintenance here, which this more conveniently sorts to by each actual state. However, we have to concede that state maintenance is usually pretty low, and this figure very rarely exceeds 10% of your total government spending. With that said, it can certainly get quite bad if you're using a lot of state edicts. And the base state maintenance of a province, for example, if you look at Yorkshire, comes from 2 factors. The development of the provinces that have been stated, as well as the second factor that I bet you know nothing about. So let us, for this demonstration case, consider Pale here. Pale has 8 development and is stated, so if we hover over here we can see that Pale is giving us a state maintenance of 0.07. So far so good. I would like to also just remind everyone that our capital is here in London. Now, I've gone to Australia, and I've decided to colonize a province with 8 development just for the same purpose of comparison, and this is going to be Port Albert I've set up here. Now, when we look at the state maintenance of Port Albert, which should be the exact same as Pale, because they both have 8 development, we're going to see that actually our state maintenance is 0.23. That is because state maintenance is also affected by the province distance to your capital, which is a really cool idea. It's kind of a way of stopped nerfing large empires, and if you want to full state the world, as it were, it's going to be more expensive to do so. It's more expensive to maintain state control over territories far away from the capital. It's a bit of a weird calculation because it is directed distance calculation, aka as the crow flies. So instead of calculating the quote-unquote naval distances from Port Arthur that has to sail around Australia, it's calculating the state distances assuming we have planes, as it basically just draws a straight line from London. This also means that very technically, because the world, and I do apologize if anyone disagrees with me, is round, meaning that you can go around it, well, the longest distance differential, as it were, is probably going to be a capital in somewhere like Denmark versus a stated province somewhere in the south of New Zealand. Because any kind of province distance, for example, from here to Alaska, well, it's technically further away if you were to go the full way around. However, the province distance calculation is smart enough to take the short direction across the 0, line. That's the 0, line that you can see straight down here. This is the 0, line, right? Very straight, very 0. But it can cross it. Now, some things can't. For example, you can't actually have straight crossings that cross a straight line. So if we wanted to add a naval strait between this province here to this wasteland here, the straight crossing line would go all the way around the map, the long way around. But that is not the case for, as the crow flies, state maintenance calculations. God, that was a mouthful. Anyway, I do think it's a cool idea. Unfortunately, I think one of the reasons it's basically never noticed or talked about is the fact that state maintenance is kind of already a joke. Unless you get out of your way to run loads of edicts, state maintenance is very rarely an expense that you notice. And by the time you manage to stack up 100 ducats in, say, state maintenance expenditure, you're probably making thousands of ducats because you've stated half the planet. I think making state maintenance a more relevant feature of EU4 would be quite cool. It'd be a hard nerf to larger empires, and especially be a buff, as it were, for going tall again, because they would have just less states to maintain, as it were. And this distance modifier, if it's made even more brutal, could be another way of nerfing blobbing, as it were, because as you get further and further away from your capital, you get less and less relative value out of your provinces without reinvesting back into them, because just blindly stating them is actually not going to be always profitable. I mean, even in our extreme case here from London all the way down to Port Arthur, it's actually without any buildings on a development province is still going to be just barely paying for itself. And the reason is that we're already making 0.023 ducats at 10% autonomy. Once this hits 0% autonomy, we're going to be paying for ourselves, and we are basically taking the extreme of distance here already. And again, as a reminder, we have no production efficiency bonuses, we have wrong religion, wrong culture with no buildings built. It's only up from here. And this is also, yet again, to be clear, on top of a terrible trade good. We've practically rigged this against ourselves, and we're still breaking even on the state maintenance versus state income chart. But that's all I have to say about point number 4, so let's move on to point number 5. Now, for feature number 5, I'm going to stay on England for this demonstration, as it were, although that's a strong word. Now, if there's ever a feature that is in the game, and very much present in the game, but has genuinely almost zero game impact because it practically never comes up, however, it's just an excellent way of showing the age of EU4 and the iterations that it's gone through, I think it's probably going to be this one. So what is this feature? Well, first of all, let's discuss stack wiping in battles. Now, there are two types of stack wipes that you can achieve. Let's say this is a 14k stack run by Prussia with Prussian ideas. They've taken Miltech 16, they've completed quality economic offensive, they have really good army quality, they have a 6-6 general, everything's great, and they're coming up against a 13k English stack. They've taken naval maritime, they have no army quality, they're 3 Miltechs behind. I think even if they're pretty similar numbers, it won't be too big of a surprise if the amount of damage and morale differences that Prussia has on this England is going to be so insane that England's going to get stack wiped. But it's not going to be stack wiped because there was a 10-to-1 ratio. It's going to be stack wiped what's called conventionally, and this is what stack wiping in the game code actually refers to. There's another type of stack wiping though, and that is if you outnumber the enemy 10-to-1. If it were to be really strict, that's more referred to as overrunning the enemy. So for example, you have an 11k stack and they built a 1k stack in Sussex, you march upon it when you just 10-to-1 it immediately, regardless of your army quality or any other kind of impacts like that. Well, with this game feature, dictates that if you have a 2 institution advantage over your enemy, that is outnumbering you 10-to-1, you are immune to being overrun. That is very specifically not stack wiped, but the 10-to-1 overrun mechanic does not apply to you if you have 2 or more institutions ahead of the enemy. Wow, what a specific example. Back in the day when institutions certainly mattered a lot more. Now with institutions being relatively acquirable through development, and now with AI even asking for institution spreading, it's not too unusual to see the AI actually run around with most of the institutions. Granted, you're still going to encounter this situation sometimes, namely for a colonizer like England, you will probably pick up Renaissance by the 1450s, at which point you will be, for example, reaching America, and you'll be fighting natives that tend to be 2 institutions behind because they've not embraced feudalism or Renaissance. In this case, you can technically encounter this feature if you have a 1k stack, or even dare I say a 2k stack, guarding a colony, and then a native that's 2 institutions behind on you will walk onto that province and attack you. However, they're not going to be like 10 Miltechs behind. Even if they're going to be Miltech 1 fighting, say, Miltech 7, you're outnumbered 10-to-1, you're probably just going to be conventionally wiped. Not 10-to-1 wiped, but you're going to be conventionally wiped. And so, even if you accidentally leave behind a 1 or 2k stack behind and the AI encounters them, you're usually not paying attention, otherwise you'd not have a 1k stack get caught by a 10k native stack. So when you come back to it, the time that you see the notification, it's because you've lost the battle to the native, and so the stack is dead. So you probably didn't realize this feature existed. It also doesn't apply to natives. And now what I mean by natives are not the American natives, but the natives in, for example, the Gold Coast, a province coming up twice today. Because, well, even if there was a province with 10k natives, natives don't have institutions. Their institution embracement is null out of null, meaning they're never more than 2 institutions behind you because they have simultaneously embraced none of the institutions and also all institutions in the game. They are simply beyond the concept of institutions, and hence do not play by the rules of being 2 institutions behind or ahead, meaning that they can never 10-to-1 overrun you either. And it's also just quite difficult to find a province with 10k natives. I mean, 8k natives is already quite a lot, and there's not that many out there. I mean, there's a 9k native on Heroes, for example, but yeah. Even the Philippines are looking at around 7,000 natives up to 5,000 on their more populated provinces. So indeed, you're going to struggle finding 10k natives outside of mods. So yeah, you can't be overrun if you have 2 institutions ahead on someone, but you basically never are because the AI tends to keep up on institutions, and even in situations where, you know, you actually have 2 institutions on someone, you're still outnumbered 10-to-1, so you usually just get stack wiped anyway. I basically have never really seen the 2 institutions rule ahead, meaning you can't be overrun rule ever apply, and for that reason I think it's certainly earning a spot as the most obscure mechanic of that nature. So, how many of these did you know? Make sure to tell me down below. But unfortunately, that is all the time I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching, with a special thank you to all my channel members, especially Ark, Solar, W Haste, Solemon, Star72, Lord Zendikar, Nick Fassbender, Nanhatan, Nikas, The Awesome Rabbit, Best Pro Gaming, Gramil Flavia, Kono, Andrea Zalberg, Deki, Sov, Mobkiller, Anthony35, AC Napo, Glorious Leader, Zerkis, Mr. Goomshock, Yukata, Danray, Private Claw, Jack, and Marley.